It is 1446 BC, and a man is standing on a mountain that is on fire. He has been up here before. The first time, he took off his sandals because the ground was holy. This time, he is holding a reed pen, and the voice that speaks from the fire is not giving him commands. It is giving him a calendar. 7 dates, 7 appointments, 7 moments in history that have not happened yet, written down by a shepherd turned lawgiver on a mountain in the Sinai desert, 15 centuries before the man they point to is born in a stable 600 miles away. His name is Moses, and he does not fully understand what he is writing. But here is what he writes. In the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, God uses a specific word for these 7 feasts. Not praznik, not holiday, not celebration. The Hebrew word is moed, which means appointed meeting, a rendezvous, a moment circled on the calendar of heaven where the eternal and the temporal were scheduled to collide. 7 moedim, 7 divine appointments. And here is what most people miss. Before Moses writes down a single feast, God says something strange, something that has haunted Bible scholars for 3,000 years. He says, "This month shall be the beginning of months for you." God reset the calendar. He did not adjust it. He did not revise it. He picked up time itself like a book, opened it to a specific page, and said, "Here, this is where history begins. Everything before this was preface." We will come back to that moment. We will come back to what it means that God chose to restart time at the exact month the Lamb would die. But not yet. For now, 7 appointments written in fire on a mountain by a man who had no idea he was writing a biography. This is not a history lesson. This is not a theology lecture. This is not a coincidence. This is a screenplay, 15 centuries in the making, and every feast is a scene, every sacrifice is a costume, and every date on the Hebrew calendar is a cue for the Son of God to walk on stage. 4 of those appointments have already been kept on the exact dates, at the exact hours, in ways that defy every law of probability that mathematics can produce. 3 are still coming, and when they arrive, you will not mistake them. The first feast on the calendar is Passover. And to understand what Passover means, not the children's version, not the flannel board version, but the version that should stop your breath, you need to stand in Jerusalem on the afternoon of Nisan 14 in the year AD 30 and look at 2 things at the same time. Look at the temple courts first. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century, recorded that at Passover, the population of Jerusalem swelled to over 2 million pilgrims. He calculated that in a single Passover afternoon, the priests of Israel slaughtered approximately 256,000 lambs from 3 o'clock until sundown. The court of priests ran red. The smoke from the altar rose over the city like a column you could see from the hills. The sound of 256,000 animals was not a quiet thing. Now look at the hill outside the city walls. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, on Nisan 14, as the first Passover lamb's throat was opened in the temple courts below, a man on a Roman cross above the city opened his mouth and said 4 words, "It is finished," and died. Now go back to Exodus 12. God told Moses that the Passover lamb was to be selected on Nisan 10, 4 days before it was killed. 4 days of inspection, 4 days of living in the household, becoming known, becoming familiar. Then on Nisan 14, the knife. On Nisan 10, AD 30, Jesus rode a donkey through the eastern gate of Jerusalem while the crowds waved branches and shouted his name. He entered the city. He taught in the temple courts for 4 days. The Pharisees questioned him. The Sadducees questioned him. The lawyers questioned him. 4 days of inspection, and they found no fault in him. Then, on Nisan 14, the 9th, the Hebrew word for Passover is Pesach. Most translations say it means to pass over, as in God passed over the houses marked with blood. But ancient Hebrew scholars noted that the root carries a deeper image. A mother bird hovering over her nest. Pesach means to hover over protectively, to spread wings over what is underneath and shield it from destruction. God did not merely skip past those houses in Egypt. He stood over them, wings spread, covering what the blood identified as his. The man who orchestrated Jesus' death was the high priest Caiaphas. He chose the date. He enforced the timeline. He looked at the crowds gathering for Passover and said, recorded in John chapter 11, "It is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish." He meant it as political calculation. He had no idea he was writing theology. The priest who condemned the Passover lamb to death was the high priest himself. Stay with me. The second feast begins the morning after Passover. Feast of Unleavened Bread, Nisan 15 through 21. For 7 days, every Israelite household is commanded to remove all leaven from the house, every crumb, every trace of yeast. Leaven in Scripture is never a neutral symbol. It is always, without exception, a picture of sin, of corruption that spreads silently through what it touches. For 7 days, Israel ate bread with no corruption in it. For those same 7 days, the body of Jesus lay in a borrowed tomb cut from rock in a garden near the city wall. Psalm 16, verse 10, written by David 1,000 years before the crucifixion. "You will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your Holy One see decay." The feast that commanded Israel to place sinless bread at the center of their table for 7 days was a portrait, painted 1,000 years in advance, of a sinless man lying in a sealed tomb, his body held in a stillness that defied every law of biology. Corruption could not touch what leaven was never allowed to enter. But it gets stranger. On the morning after the Sabbath, Nisan 16, or in some years Nisan 17, the priest performed a ritual that most Christians have never heard of. A Levite priest walked out to the barley fields at sunrise. He cut the first sheaf of the new harvest, one single bundle of grain. He carried it back to the temple, and he waved it before God as an offering. This was Bikurim, Firstfruits. In Jewish agricultural theology, the Bikurim was not just a gift, it was a guarantee. The first sheaf waved before God was the proof, the pledge, that the full harvest was coming. You were not waving what you had. You were declaring what was on the way. The first fruit sheaf meant the rest of this is real. The rest of this is certain. The rest of this will come. On the morning of Nisan 16 or 17 in AD 30, as a Levite priest carried a sheaf of grain toward the temple at sunrise, a woman was walking toward a garden tomb on the other side of the city wall. Her name was Mary Magdalene. She had 7 demons cast out of her by the man she was now going to anoint with burial spices. She was not expecting a miracle. She was expecting a corpse. The tomb was open. The grave clothes were folded. And a man was standing in the garden, and she genuinely thought, he was the gardener, until he said her name. And this is where it gets remarkable. The Apostle Paul, writing to the church at Corinth, did not reach for poetry or metaphor when he tried to explain the resurrection. He reached for a feast. But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, he wrote, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The first sheaf, the guarantee. Mary Magdalene was not visiting a grave. She was standing at the Bikurim, the moment that pledged, with the authority of the living God, that every person who has ever been put in the ground will one day hear their name spoken in a garden and rise. 3 feasts, 1 week, 1 man, and we are only halfway through the calendar. 3 feasts, 1 week, 1 man. Passover. The lamb dies on the exact date, at the exact hour, as the temple lambs are slaughtered below him. Unleavened bread. The sinless body lies in a tomb that corruption cannot enter. Firstfruits. The guarantee of the harvest walks out of the stone and says a woman's name in a garden at sunrise. If this is the first time you are seeing the Hebrew calendar this way, you are not alone. And there are 4 more feasts to go. If this is changing the way you read your Bible, subscribe. It means you will not miss what comes next. Because 50 days from Firstfruits, the 4th feast arrives. And what happens on that morning will turn the entire world upside down. 50 days after Firstfruits, the 4th feast arrives. The Hebrew name is Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks. The Greek name, the one most Christians know, is Pentecost, from the Greek word for 50. 50 days counted from the morning the first fruit sheaf was waved before God in the temple. 50 days from the resurrection morning in the garden. To understand what happens on this day, you need to go back, not to the upper room in Jerusalem, but to a mountain in the desert 15 centuries earlier. When Moses came down from Sinai with the law, the people of Israel were at the bottom of the mountain, and they were not waiting quietly. They had built a golden calf. They were dancing before an idol while the finger of God was still writing on stone above them. Moses came down. He saw what they had done. And before the sun set that day, 3,000 people died for breaking the law that had just been given. 3,000 people. One day. The law written on stone. Now, hold that number. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who lived at the same time as Jesus, wrote that the rabbis taught something remarkable about Sinai. They taught that when God spoke the law from the mountain, his voice split into 70 languages simultaneously, so that every nation under heaven could hear the words of God in their own tongue. The fire of Sinai was not meant for Israel alone. It was meant for the world. Philo wrote the theology. God wrote the fulfillment. Acts chapter 2, verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. 120 people. A fisherman from Galilee who had denied Jesus 3 times around a charcoal fire. A group of women who had stood at the cross when the men ran. A brother of Jesus who had not believed in him during his ministry and now could not stop talking about him. 120 people in a room waiting because Jesus had told them to wait. Then the wind came, not a breeze. The Greek word Luke uses is poinou, a violent rush of air, like the sound of a great storm filling a house from the inside. And then fire, divided tongues of fire, resting on each of them, not consuming them, resting. And then they spoke. Every language, every tongue, every dialect of the known world pouring out of 120 people who had grown up speaking Aramaic in fishing villages in Galilee. The crowd outside heard it. They pressed in from every nation, Parthians, Medes, Elamites, people from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Libya, Rome, Crete, Arabia, and every one of them heard the same message in their own language, the language of their mother, the language of their childhood. Pay attention to this. The rabbis said God's voice split into 70 languages at Sinai so the world could hear the law. On Pentecost, God's spirit split into every language so the world could hear the gospel. Sinai was the rehearsal. Pentecost was the performance. Peter stood up. The same Peter who had warmed his hands at a charcoal fire while a servant girl identified him as a follower of Jesus. And he said 3 times, "I do not know the man," that Peter. He stood up in front of tens of thousands of pilgrims in Jerusalem and he preached. He preached from the Psalms. He preached from the prophet Joel. He told them that the man they had crucified 53 days ago had walked out of a tomb, had ascended into heaven, and had sent this fire as proof that he was alive and seated at the right hand of God. And here is the part nobody tells you. On the day God gave the law at Sinai, 3,000 people died. On the day God gave the Spirit at Pentecost, 3,000 people came to life. The law written on stone killed what it could not cure. The Spirit poured on flesh gave life to what the law could only condemn. Paul would spend the rest of his life writing letters trying to explain the difference. But God said it first, in the calendar, in the arithmetic of 2 feast days separated by 15 centuries, 4 feasts down. Spring feasts, all 4, all fulfilled, all kept on the exact dates at the exact hours, in ways that required the cooperation of Roman governors, Jewish high priests, crowds of pilgrims, a garden outside the city wall, and a morning wind in an upper room. Now, the calendar goes quiet. Weeks pass. Months pass. Pentecost becomes a memory that becomes a movement that becomes a church that spreads across the Roman Empire and then across the world and then across 2,000 years. And the 3 remaining feasts, the fall feasts, sit on the Hebrew calendar like unopened letters, written, addressed, sealed, waiting for the day their recipient arrives to open them. Those 3 feasts are in the 7th month, the month of Tishri, and they deal with things that have not happened yet, things that the book of Revelation describes in language so vivid it is almost unbearable to read. A trumpet blast that no one will mistake for anything else. A day of accounting so holy that even the angels are silent. And a feast, the final feast, in which God himself comes to live among his people. Not as a visitor, not as a teacher, not as a man who can be nailed to a cross and sealed in a tomb forever. Now watch what happens next. The 7th month of the Hebrew calendar is called Tishri. It begins in the early autumn, September or October by our reckoning, and it holds within it 3 feast days so compressed, so layered, so heavy with meaning that Jewish tradition calls this 30-day stretch the days of awe. In the spring, God rehearsed the death and resurrection of his son. In the fall, he is rehearsing something else entirely. The 5th feast is trumpets, Yom Teruah, the day of the blast. On Tishri 1st, a priest lifts a ram's horn to his mouth and blows. The sound is not musical. It is not pleasant. The Hebrew word teruah means a blast, a shout, a war cry. The sound a watchman makes from the city wall when the enemy is no longer on the horizon, but at the gate. Every man, woman, and child in Israel stopped what they were doing when the teruah sounded. It meant the king is moving. Pay attention. But here is what made Yom Teruah unlike every other feast on the calendar. Every other feast had a fixed, predictable date. You knew when Passover was coming. You knew when Pentecost was coming. You could mark your calendar and prepare. Yom Teruah was different. It fell on the first day of the 7th month, which meant it began with the new moon. And in ancient Israel, the new moon was not calculated in advance. It was observed. 2 witnesses had to spot the first sliver of the new moon in the night sky and run to the high priest to report what they had seen. Only then could the priest sound the shofar and declare the feast had begun, which meant that no one, not the priests, not the people, not the scholars, could tell you the exact day or the exact hour the blast would sound. You could estimate, you could watch and wait, but you could not know. Hold that thought, because in Matthew chapter 24, a group of disciples asked Jesus a direct question. What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And Jesus answered them. He spoke of wars and rumors of wars, of the abomination of desolation, of a tribulation unlike anything the world had seen. And then he said something that has confused scholars and comforted believers for 2,000 years. But about that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. No one knows the day or the hour. He was not being vague. He was not being evasive. He was quoting a feast. He was telling his disciples, in language every Jewish listener would have recognized immediately, that his return would come like Yom Teruah comes. You will not calculate it. You will not schedule around it. You will be watching. You will be waiting. And then, without warning, without negotiation, without a countdown clock, the blast will sound and the king will move. The Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Thessalonica, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God." The trump of God, Yom Teruah, still waiting. 10 days after trumpets, the 6th feast arrives, and it is the holiest day of the entire Hebrew year, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Go back with me to the book of Leviticus chapter 16. Aaron, the high priest, brother of Moses, first in a long line of men who would stand between Israel and the holiness of God, is given instructions for this day that are unlike any other instructions in the Torah. 2 goats, identical, chosen by Lot. The first goat is killed. Its blood is carried by the high priest into the Holy of Holies, the innermost room of the tabernacle, the room where the presence of God rested above the Ark of the Covenant, and sprinkled on the mercy seat. This happened once a year. If the priest was not ritually pure, he did not come back out. The blood of the first goat covered the sins of the nation. The second goat was not killed. The high priest placed both hands on his head, both hands pressing down, leaning the full weight of his body, and he confessed over it every sin of Israel, every failure, every rebellion, every broken covenant, every act of cruelty and cowardice and idolatry for the entire past year, spoken aloud over the head of this animal. And then the goat was driven out into the wilderness, into the desert, never to return. 2 goats, one killed, one exiled. At the cross, Jesus fulfilled both roles simultaneously. He was the goat whose blood was carried into the true Holy of Holies, heaven itself, as the book of Hebrews explains, not the copy made with human hands. And he was the scapegoat, the one onto whom every sin of every person who has ever lived was pressed with the full weight of heaven's hands and driven out, taken away, removed as far as the east is from the west. But there's one more thing. The prophet Zechariah, writing 500 years before Jesus, recorded a vision of a future day, a day that has not yet come. He wrote, "They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son." The nation of Israel, the physical descendants of the men and women who stood at the foot of Sinai when Moses came down with the calendar, has not yet had that moment. The morning of Zechariah chapter 12 has not yet happened. The national recognition, the grief, the turning. Yom Kippur has not yet seen its ultimate fulfillment. It is still waiting, like an unopened letter, addressed, sealed, but not yet read. And then, 5 days after Yom Kippur, the seventh feast begins. Sukkot, Tabernacles, the Feast of Booths. For 7 days, every family in Israel leaves their house and lives in a temporary shelter. A sukkah, a booth of branches and cloth, open to the sky. They eat in it. They sleep in it. They gather in it. They remember that their ancestors lived in tents in the wilderness, that God himself traveled with them in a tabernacle made of curtains and acacia wood, his presence moving when they moved, stopping when they stopped. And now, open the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh. The Greek word John uses for what the Word did next is eskenosin. It means he pitched his tent. He set up his sukkah. He built his booth among us and moved in, not as a visitor passing through, not as a teacher who would eventually return to wherever he came from, but as the fulfillment of every temporary shelter Israel ever slept in under a desert sky. God came to dwell. And now, go back to the beginning. Go back to Moses on the mountain. Go back to the fire and the reed pen and the strange thing God said before he gave a single feast. This month shall be the beginning of months for you. He reset time. He picked the month of Passover, the month of the Lamb, and said, this is where the calendar starts. This is year zero. Everything else is counted from here. In 1894, a British astronomer and scholar named Sir Robert Anderson published a calculation that had taken him years to verify. Working from the decree of the Persian king Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem, recorded in Nehemiah chapter 2, 444 BC, he counted forward using the Hebrew calendar of 360 days per year. He was looking for the exact number of days in Daniel's 69 prophetic weeks. The countdown, Daniel said, would lead to the appearance of the Messiah. The number was 173,880 days. He checked it against the Roman calendar. He cross-referenced it with astronomical records of lunar cycles. He verified it against the historical date of Artaxerxes' decree confirmed by secular historians. And the day those 173,880 days landed on, the exact day was Nisan 10, AD 30, the day Jesus rode a donkey through the eastern gate of Jerusalem, the day the Passover lamb was selected, the Hebrew calendar God gave Moses, the prophecy Daniel wrote in a Babylonian prison, the Roman calendar that crucified the man they pointed to. All three converged, not approximately, not roughly, not within a few days, on a single afternoon when a crowd waved branches and shouted a name. This was not numerology. This was not poetry. This was engineering. God did not reset the calendar because he was being dramatic. He reset the calendar because he wanted you, 2,000 years later, sitting wherever you are sitting right now, to understand that not one moment of what you have just heard was accidental. The God who scheduled the death of his son to the hour also scheduled his return. The God who kept Passover, unleavened bread, Firstfruits, and Pentecost on the exact dates will keep trumpets, atonement, and tabernacles on the exact dates. And on the day the final feast is fulfilled, the day Sukkot reaches its eternal meaning, this is what John saw and wrote and could barely find language for. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Not a sukkah of branches, not a tabernacle of curtains, not a body of flesh that could be nailed to wood and sealed in stone. Forever. 7 feasts, 1 calendar, 1 man. Before we close, I want to give you 3 things to carry with you, because a script this old deserves more than a summary. The first is a truth. God did not react to history. He wrote it. The calendar Moses transcribed on a mountain in the Sinai desert was not a religious schedule. It was a prophetic document, a biography written 15 centuries before its subject was born. 4 feasts fulfilled at the first coming of Jesus, on the exact dates, at the exact hours, in ways that required the unwitting cooperation of Roman governors and Jewish high priests and crowds of pilgrims who had no idea they were actors in a screenplay older than their nation. 3 feasts remain. They will be fulfilled with the same precision. The same God who kept every spring appointment will keep every fall appointment. He has never once been early. He has never once been late. The second is personal. You are living in the gap between Pentecost and trumpets, between the fire that fell in the upper room and the blast that has not yet sounded. This gap has stretched now for 2,000 years, and it can feel on the hard days like God has gone quiet, like the calendar has stalled, like the remaining feasts are so far off they might as well be myth. They are not myth. The gap is not silence. The gap is harvest season, the season that Firstfruits guaranteed. The firstfruit sheaf waved before God on resurrection morning was the pledge that the full harvest was coming. You are the harvest. The gap exists because God is patient, not slow patient, unwilling that any should miss the feast. The third is the one I want you to sit with. The God who loved you enough to write your rescue into a calendar before you existed, who rehearsed it in fire and blood and bread for 14 centuries, who kept every appointment to the hour, who reset time itself around the moment the lamb would die. That God has not forgotten the remaining 3 feasts on his calendar. He has not forgotten you. And on the day the teruah sounds, the blast that no one will calculate, on the hour that no one will predict, every temporary shelter you have ever built to protect yourself from the wilderness will finally, permanently come down, because the dwelling place of God will be with men. Which feast in this video changed the way you read your Bible? Tell me below. I read every comment. Moses held a reed pen on a mountain surrounded by fire. He wrote down 7 appointments. He had no idea he was writing a biography. Neither did the men who kept them.